we're legally allowed to sell this product, but does it actually work? Does it do the thing it says it does? And does it really solve a problem for the person that's using it? That's kind of my niche.
Welcome to LifeSci Continuum. Today I get the chance to speak with Shreya Divatia, Global Clinical Evidence Generation Strategy Lead.
My superpower is figuring out what went wrong or what's about to go wrong.
Over the last 10 years, Shreya has supported international product launches, overseen global clinical trial programs at all stages, and developed and designed clinical studies.
That's probably the million-dollar question. A small company, a startup, is better suited to do this kind of fail-fast activity and learning from your mistakes than a large company which has a ton of stakeholders and strategy.
Shreya shares a case study today on a rapid launch of a new in-hospital wearable device and software as a medical device remote monitoring solution for a major brand. Once you go down the path of developing a product, you're not necessarily just a surgeon or a scientist or an engineer anymore. You're now an entrepreneur. You need to have real world data. She shares her experience, the lessons she learned, and provides some pointed guidance for anyone working to combine two different technologies in a hospital setting. All right, let's go. I think what would be interesting to hear, as we start, talk a little bit about your journey. How'd you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so I started in academic research lab out of grad school. I thought I wanted to get a PhD and do research and spend the rest of my life in academia. And then I realized that I really needed something that was closer to the real world. Research for the sake of research is great, but what feels more authentic to myself is the kind of research that can actually help people and do something about the real world today, not maybe someday 20 years in the future. So I transitioned to working at a couple of different med tech companies, doing a whole variety of different things, all somehow in the clinical or the research space. So everything from running clinical trials to supporting sales to marketing, product development, building business cases and value propositions, and implementation of new products, regulatory stuff of how do you bring a new product to market. And that's kind of what led me to where we are today.
What is it that you do today?
Kind of the easy way to describe it is that an engineer builds a device and then eventually somebody in sales sells a device and then a doctor or whatever kind of healthcare professional uses the device. And at some point throughout that whole process, somebody has to make sure it actually works on real patients in the real world, in real world environments where your internet's not always 100%. And sometimes the patients are 102 years old and have very cold, wrinkly skin. And that's kind of my niche. It's when do you come in and say, oh, great, we're legally allowed to sell this product, but does it actually work? Does it do the thing it says it does? And does it really solve a problem for the person that's using it?
I love that. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Before we get into some of the discussion around that, tell me a little bit about you. What is your personal superpower?
My superpower is figuring out what went wrong or what's about to go wrong. And that's not always a superpower when you ask my boss or my teachers back in school, because I'm very quick to point out what somebody has done wrong or where the logical fallacy is. But it's also this way to quickly diagnose a problem that maybe not everybody sees yet and come up with a way to fix it by really getting to the root of what's causing the problem, not just, you're getting a disconnection error, but what is at the root of that problem? What on the technical, physical, biochemical side is creating that issue, and how do we solve it before it explodes?
Yeah, and I think when we're dealing with founders particularly who have a focus on bringing whatever their idea is to life, they can tend to have blinders on. They have blind spots where they just don't see the issues. They don't have the experience. They're just so excited about bringing this thing to market that they aren't focused on where it might not work.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to have blinders on and focus on getting to your goal and not worry about all of the little things in order to bring something to market. It's just that before it actually goes to market, somebody's got to make sure that we've checked our blind spots.
Exactly, exactly. And I think it's why we need people just like you is it's really hard for us to self-assess
Yeah.
and to look critically at, and not just critically, but look at everything
Yeah.
and make sure that we're covered because it's those places where we don't look that typically tend to kind of come back and bite us.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, right? When we spoke before, you shared a little bit of your experience. Why don't you set the stage for us? Give us a little bit of an overview of the particular challenge that we talked about in the wearables market.
Yeah, so I was working with a very large multinational medical device company that had recently acquired a small wearable product, and that product had been developed for an out-of-hospital use case. It monitored vital signs mostly for the worried well, so kind of healthy adults who are exercising and want to see their stats as they're running a mile, or sports teams or something like that. And this big med tech company had acquired it and was trying to bring that wearable into the hospital space, kind of in the face of Fitbits and Apple Watches and you name it in the wearable space. The company wanted to protect its market share and its footprint within the hospital by bringing these next generation wireless wearable type devices into the hospital and providing that kind of continuous monitoring data to nurses and doctors in the hospital. And we had that medtech company had a pre-existing backend software that they were using to connect into the wearable device and display the data as it was being collected, with the idea that it would have doctors or nurses monitor their patients to get that continuous data from patients that otherwise wouldn't have that kind of continuous monitoring in the hospital.
What made it seem viable at the time?
It was a real problem, and it seemed like the right time. These patients in the general medical surgical units of the hospital didn't have continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring was very widely used and really relied on in other parts of the hospital or in other care spaces. It was the era of the Fitbit and the Google Pixel Watch, whatever it was called, and the Apple Watch, where all of a sudden all kinds of people outside of the hospital in their regular day-to-day lives were getting continuous data about their health, their heart rate, their blood oxygen level, etc. And there was this big gap in the hospital where they didn't have this kind of continuous data that is really important when a patient is sick and is at risk of getting sicker. 12,000 things to do every single minute of their shift. And at best, they're able to go check on each of their patients maybe 2 or 3 times max during an 8-hour shift, sometimes even less than that with all the staffing challenges and everything. So the idea of providing more continuous data about how their patients were doing to help nurses see, okay, which patient needs more of my time or attention right now? Who's at risk for a fall or an adverse event or needing to go to the ICU or something like that really was a problem that we had truly heard from the market, the people that were going to use it, that they needed more information so they could their time and their resources. And this company did have and thought they understood how to bring a new technology into the hospital space, which is a huge challenge for 1,000 reasons. Everything from getting approval from all of the different stakeholders to how do you physically up in the ceiling and plug in an internet router, because this is the hospital, there's patients there. You don't want to drill into the ceiling and then a ceiling tile falls on somebody's head. And so we felt that this solution was well timed and it fit a need in the market, and we felt we had the resources and the expertise to really make it work in that space.
Okay, so a lot of we felt and thought and
Exactly.
planned on, and I think we know where this is going. So what were some of the blind spots that you ran into as you started implementation? What were some of the things that popped up?
So we were taking 2 things that had been built completely independently, this wearable device made by this small startup and this software backend built by the large medtech company, but for a different purpose, and trying to mash them together to create one holistic solution. And neither of those things were kind of fit for their purpose. They weren't built to do this particular thing that we were trying to do. And surprise, surprise, that created some technical challenges. We were trying to integrate this hardware technology and this software technology together in a way that didn't quite work because we were retrofitting a solution. And we were taking a product developed for the healthy adult population into a hospital setting where the patients are not the same as the healthy adult population, and a software product that was intended for kind of out of hospital, really low resource care settings into a medical surgical unit, which is increasingly a pretty high acuity unit with a lot of patients and a lot of things happening at all times. And this was 2015, 16, 17. So the internet was great outside of the hospital. In the hospital, it existed.
Not so much.
Exactly.
Was there maybe a particular moment when you realized that maybe this just wasn't going to work out as intended?
Yeah, it was day 3, which was really day 1. We had chosen this hospital for a lot of reasons as our first implementation site to trial this new connected technology. And day 1 and day 2 were training. We trained 7 different shifts of nurses about how to use this technology, what it was, how it was going to help them, how to set it up, which patients it was for, all that kind of stuff. And then on day 3, we went to actually start for the first time. And one of the nurses applied that wearable device on a patient, and we thought everything was great. It looked connected. It said, we're all set. And then we went back to the nurse's station to check the software backend, and it wasn't connected. It said that the device was disconnected from the patient, that it was streaming data through the internet and Bluetooth and all of that software piece, but it said device was physically disconnected from the patient. So
Wow.
we went back in the room and we looked at it, and it was still there.
Was it delivering any accurate data, or was it?
It wasn't delivering any data at all because the device
Okay.
thought it wasn't connected to a patient.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's on day 3. You've trained everybody on this. All right. And so what do you do in a situation like that? Sort of taking a step back, how do you manage a situation like that, and what do you do next?
Well, it was Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, and we had flights out 2 hours later. So we decided maybe it's the full moon. Maybe we just did something wrong. Let's just take it off and give ourselves the weekend, and we'll start fresh on Monday. Surprise, surprise. It wasn't magically fixed on Monday, but at least we had taken a few days to breathe, consider what the problem might be, what we might be able to do to start troubleshooting and figuring out where exactly the problem was. And we were refreshed and ready to really dig into solving this problem. I think that was a really important first step, is making sure that you're not reacting immediately to a problem, because emotions are high. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of attention and pressure, and you're kind of a bundle of nerves. This thing you've been creating for all this time is now going into the real world. And obviously our hearts kind of sank when it didn't work. Staying there all night and trying to fix it would not have done anybody any good.
Right. That's just, sometimes it just leads to more stress and anxiety and further exacerbates the problem in this situation. That makes perfect sense. That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that story. That's not an enviable situation to be in. Let's sort of take a step back out of that situation for a moment. This entire situation kind of spurred the team to start doing some of the work that I think we would consider that we'd want to do up front. You were, I think, trying to move quickly, right, and protect market share, but first mover advantage and all of that. Let's talk about, we've taken a step back now, and we're looking kind of critically at how do we do this, maybe follow the process the right way. How do you get started on that? How do you take those first steps, and what do you look at?
There's not really a roadmap for exactly what needs to happen or we could have done ahead of time to make sure this worked, except trialing it and seeing what didn't work and then going from there. But that process could have started a lot sooner, before we had a big kickoff and trained all the nurses and told everybody it was going to work. 2 weeks earlier, we could have done a quick trial, one with just a handful of patients in the real world, and maybe we would have caught the problem then. We didn't know what we didn't know. And what it turns out we didn't know is that it's not enough to just meet the regulatory FDA requirements for bringing a medical device to market, because we had done all that. We had done all of the official testing. We had done all of the integration and verification and validation. But there's something about translating a technology from a lab setting or an office setting into the real world where things go wrong. And there's so many pieces of it that it's it's hard to predict what's going to go wrong. And one of the best solutions for that is a trial to make sure that just checking to see what happens before you go too far. But the other is really being prepared for things to go wrong, to know what you need to do and who are the people you're going to call in to troubleshoot and try to come to a solution if one were to happen. And for example, those first couple of days we were on site, we didn't have any of the software or hardware engineers there because there was this false sense of security that it worked in the office, so why wouldn't it work here?
Right.
We also didn't get enough expert feedback from people who had done things like this before. Once we started trying to troubleshoot, found all of these incredible experts who had done this kind of hospital integration before, and maybe they couldn't have predicted the problem, but they could have helped us prepare for problems like this and be prepared for a problem to occur, whatever kind of problem it was. We really had these high hopes that everything was just going to go smoothly the first time, and we had these blinders of course it's going to work.
If I could just jump in, I think I see this a lot actually in our space, in that we sort of have a plug and play mentality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, things are so easy in general for us today that oftentimes things just work. Like we buy it, it connects to, it just does what it's supposed to. And I think that ease of use for us on the consumer side then leads to sometimes unrealistic expectations when you're in the situation of solving a problem. You expect that, well, I just thought of the solution, it should just work. And that it really isn't the case, particularly in environments like, you and I are dealing with.
A lot of times, the people who are developing technologies like this, whether as a founder or an engineer or whatever your role is, these people, we are good at technology and we are familiar with how it works, how to troubleshoot things, how to reset the Bluetooth connection on a phone, or you'll turn your computer off and turn it back on again, kind of instinctively when you see a problem like this. There's this baseline technological literacy that is really, really common for founders or early stage startups in this space. People who've grown up with technology are of upper middle class socioeconomic status, college educated, et cetera, et cetera. And we forget that that's not the case everywhere. We spent a long time teaching some of the nurses where the Bluetooth icon was on one of the mobile devices we were using for this solution. We had to remind them that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are different signals. And just because one is working doesn't mean the other one's working. And it would never have occurred to me that those were things that would be difficult. And that was a good reminder of a headspace that is really difficult to have in development and early stages of kind of product ideation, which is who is your ultimate consumer, or who is going to use this product, who's going to benefit from this product, who's going to interact with it, and where are they coming from? What is their profile? What are their needs, concerns, challenges? What will they and won't they be willing to is another thing that maybe in the rollout of this product, we could have done better.
So that's a really good point, actually. The context of what's going on is super, super important. So understanding that a lot of times, especially in this environment, this one particular action may not be the only thing that I'm dealing with, and it may not be my top priority. So, the usability and utility really, really matters. And it's just got to work. Did we just continue on with that particular solution, or there was a pivot, right, to say, okay, maybe we need to build this thing from scratch, from the ground up?
We did figure out the root cause of that particular problem that we saw right off the bat, and we were able to continue with the rollout of this solution. But that was just the first issue we found. When you have something that's not fit for purpose, lots of other things pop up that you go, if I were to do this again, I would have fixed this. Or next time, I would make sure that there's a little green light that tells me it's working. Or, I didn't realize that there's not a trash can in this room. And so maybe the packaging should be different. And what turned out to be great is that with this white labeled solution kind of cobbled together from these other pieces, we got to see what was going wrong, what we would like to do differently, what our users wanted to do differently, what would have helped them believe in the product. And we were able to feed that back into an organic product development cycle to build a new hardware front end and a software back end that really was intended to do the thing we were trying to do. And because we had all these learnings from what went wrong the first time, we could, at every stage of the development process, say, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that this problem doesn't reoccur? And how do I make sure that whatever blind spots we as a team might have are being and evaluated by users before we get too far in the development cycle to fix them?
This is definitely not a failure story. This was a success in that now you were able to do a little bit of the work that we do as well, which is really the jobs to be done work. What is the actual use case? How will people use it? What are some of the environmental factors and the things that you just can't think of when you're in a lab or you're at a bench or you're in the office? And this just gave you that real world data to eventually develop a very successful product. How do you think, thinking about our audience here, how do you think a founder of, not everybody's a large company when they start. How do you think somebody can balance their sense of urgency or the need or the pressure to just move quickly and get something out the door? From a founder's perspective, how do you balance that with working strategically?
Yeah, so I actually think a small company, a startup, is better suited to do this kind of fail fast activity and learning from your mistakes than a large company, which has a ton of stakeholders and strategy, and everything takes a lot of time. Believe in you have to try it to find out. And so as you're working through your product development, it's really, really important to just look at the gap that you're trying to solve. And I don't mean conceptually, theoretically documenting where the gap is. Go watch some people for a day or a week who are eventually going to be using your solution. Don't ask them any questions. Don't ask them about your solution or ask them to try it out. Just see what their day looks like. See what they typically do with other kinds of things that are sort of similar to what you're trying to do, whether that's a device or a software or whatever. Just watch and observe and write down what you see, and then go back and map out where your solution fits in and where are the potential pain points and where are the different parts where you're intersecting with a process or a workflow or a habit that already exists, because it's those intersection points that are most critical, and they really make the difference between something that works and that everybody loves and something that is just too annoying to deal with and gets shoved in a corner.
Yeah, and when you're dealing with a big, complicated ecosystem like a hospital environment, there are a lot of external factors that are not simply the utility or the problem solved. There are entire organizational dynamics. Just because you solve a problem doesn't mean that it's easy to get that device approved internally and implemented.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say is make sure you know who your actual users are, because one of the things that I'm now obsessed with is you can't just talk to the thought leader or the subject matter expert or the key opinion leader. You've got to talk to the CNA who's going to be the one in the patient's room checking to see if the technology is still connected. You've got to talk to the hospital engineer who does regular maintenance on the servers. These aren't the people that are easy to find, and they're not necessarily people that are used to thinking about product development and providing input into a product life cycle at an early stage, but they're the ones that you're going to eventually have to convince. And so you've got to bring them in early and figure out how to build their experience into your product.
100% agree. So I was speaking with somebody else earlier about exactly this, and that when you are the developer, the designer, the person who thinks of and starts, executing on one of these products, often your thinking gets frozen kind of in that moment. Whatever whatever was going on, outside in the world or wherever the industry was, that's kind of your moment in time. You were experiencing a problem, you saw an opportunity, and you decided to engineer a solution. And sometimes years can go by between that moment and then when you go to market. And a lot of things can change very quickly now. So having those conversations and that real sort of dynamic, that data and feedback is super, super important. And people go heads down and they don't look at how the environment is changing, factor that in. The other thing we see too is, I remember a conversation a few years ago where we were doing some work of, voice of the customer. So the founder of the company was a surgeon, but the main user would be the RN. And as part of our discovery and research work, we were talking to a lot of RN, and the feedback we were getting was, we never would have designed it this way because of this right here. And when they explained it, it was really, really obvious. And there was a lot of work to convince the founder that maybe he should pause and reconsider that feedback, because everybody who used it made the same statement. And taking that feedback, and it was really hard for him, because he just really felt that he was in the right on this. But that input is important.
I once worked on a product where it was really close to the end of development, and they brought it into a hospital for the first time to test it out in the real world before actually marketing it. So that was learning from our mistakes. And the first nurse that saw it said, "Ooh, I'm going to grab that handle to drag it around." That handle was the antenna that allowed it to send the signal to the back end, and it broke immediately because it didn't occur to anybody that they were going to grab it and use it as a handle because it was right there.
Yeah, that very real, that sort of jobs to be done analysis, that like first person being there in the room and seeing how people behave and use what we make is really, that feedback is invaluable. And until you see something like what you just described, you never would have anticipated that. That would not have been on anybody's list of things we should figure out.
Yeah, but now I think about it every time.
You can't see it without remembering that. So in a process like this, there are going to be a lot of stakeholders, a lot of strong perspectives. How do you go about maybe getting, wrangling that group? How do you get alignment or accommodate all of the different parties at the table? And in a hospital environment with a device, it's huge.
That's probably the $1,000,000 question. How do you get everyone to align behind one idea? There's a humility that's required, a willingness to be wrong, a willingness to listen to somebody that may not have the same knowledge, skills, experience, etc. that you have, a desire to watch and learn, just observe and not make any judgments, that I think is really helpful in situations like this. And when you can encourage everybody to just take a beat, to put away their preconceived notions or judgments or expectations of what's going to happen and just see what is happening, I think a lot of valuable conversations happen there. And it can really be the turning point in how do you start to work together to figure out what's best for everyone and what trade-offs are okay to make versus which ones are not. That I think is a really important process, not just in product development, but in everything.
I think our experience teaches us that we are problem solvers. I've fixed this thing. Only I can do it. Why hasn't anybody else done it? The reality is the path to success, especially in this market, is really narrow. There are a million ways that this thing can go wrong. And, I think when, your user's feedback is really critical to navigating at least that aspect of the path. And so getting the, at least even before getting the feedback, just getting a process in place to understand who are all of the stakeholders. So getting alignment or visibility into who has say in the room, and then what their pain points are, what moves them. You had to work through this quite a bit, I imagine, in coming up with a solution. How did you uncover the true pain points and get to a solution that worked?
Well, the real answer is I spent all day, every day watching people try to use our first solution in a hospital for 6 straight months.
Oh, wow.
And so I got to see and hear again all of the things that people didn't like or weren't working. I don't recommend that pathway necessarily, but there is something really valuable in just putting something out there, letting people try it, and just seeing what happens, and making sure you do that as early and as often as possible, and being open to pivoting based on what you're learning at that stage. And the rushed, high pressure, get it done yesterday environment of this space. But if you don't slow down at the beginning, you're really likely to have to slow down at the end.
So thinking about, a founder who is probably pressed for time and resources, what's something maybe they could do differently so they don't kind of bump into this, in looking at, I want to commercialize a digital health solution, and I don't want to run into a situation like this. I don't have the time to spend 6 months, and it sounds like maybe you wouldn't want to, but you're very lucky to have had that experience. What would you say is something that they could do to avoid that?
I think you could take a day. We figured out this wasn't working. Can name the two products we talked about, but I could probably name half a dozen others where it takes less than 4 hours to find a big blind spot that you didn't know existed. Just take a to see who your users are, how they're going to interact with your solution, and really make sure that you are solving a problem that they agree is a problem, and you're solving it in a way that works for them. Don't assume that you know something that they don't. Don't assume that you're the one that knows everything because you found this problem that nobody else did, that you've come up with this magic solution and it's because you're the only one that's ever had this brilliant idea. There's probably a reason nobody else has done it, and you should figure out why, because you're going to have to solve that problem at some point.
What's something that you know today about bringing a digital health product to market, that you didn't, 10 years ago?
Equity, inclusivity, diversity, accessibility, the lived experience of your actual users is different than that of the people building the product, no matter what. And you've got to have that input and be open to that difference. And you've got to do it deliberately, consciously, and you've got to really believe in the value of doing something like that in order to build something that works for everyone, or at least so that you know where it doesn't work.
We talk about this as a blind spot in that, once you go down the path of developing a product, you're not necessarily just a surgeon or a scientist or an engineer anymore. You're now an entrepreneur, and you go on a journey that really changes you and changes your perspective. It's getting back to, you need to have real world data, not simply, black box in a lab somewhere. Well, it works perfectly here. Well, that's not the real world in many cases. And all of these variables, human and otherwise, they have a real impact on the efficacy of a lot of these solutions. So Absolutely. I think that point is well taken, and I don't think it's considered enough, frankly. How, if I'm at the very beginning and I sort of want to build this thinking, this strategic foresight, and this a bit of a less myopic, less focused view into my process, what do you think are some things that I could do differently?
There's a principle that I like a lot that's design thinking, and it is thinking about the whole implementation, the entire ecosystem, that allows you to start by mapping out who all the stakeholders are, what their individual experiences look like, kind of from start to finish of a particular process. You can do this with any process, whether it's, a new surgical implant or a robotic exoskeleton or making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Who are all of the people that are touching this? Where do they touch it? What is their lived experience? And when you start by really mapping it out at this broad conceptual level, it reminds you through the rest of the process where you fit in to which user's journey, and it can tell you whose input you need to get, because there's all kinds of regulations and guidelines and FDA requirements out there that tell you these are the things you're supposed to do, and you need an electrical engineer to do this and a mechanical engineer to do this, and you've got to do this kind of biocompatibility testing. And that's obviously very important. What's the why? The why is usually about who's going to use it at the end and what do they really care about.
Right. And I think we cover the what's the why in a whole nother episode, and that's a big topic, and often not thought about at some of these early stages. It's strictly a what and how, and that's really important. So we're at time. This is great.
Awesome.
I have one last question, if you could answer it for me. If you could time travel to early career you, just starting out, what would be one big piece of advice that would have a big impact on you?
Just try things. It doesn't have to be forever. You don't have to love it. You don't have to want to do something for the rest of your life. But the more things you can try and get some experience with, that knowledge is really valuable as you go through other parts of your career, both in knowing what you like and what you don't like, but also in just having a little bit of insight into the experience of somebody who does do that thing all day, every day.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much. You've been great today.
Thank you.
So if you're a life science leader or product manager and you have an interesting story you'd like to share, reach out to me on LinkedIn and we'll connect. If you're interested in learning some other lessons in marketing for life sciences or in avoiding some of the big mistakes, I cover a lot of that in my LinkedIn newsletter. So I'll drop the links to those in the description below. That's it. That's the end.